Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Reinsurance Podcast. I am your co-host, Jerad Lee.
And I'm Ben Rose. Welcome to another episode diving into the intricacies of reinsurance.
And reinsurance underwriting specifically.
And reinsurance underwriting data, even more specifically.
We're going to keep this shovel going.
How are you, first of all?
I'm good. How are you? Welcome to the studio. Thanks.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be back. It feels like a while.
It has.
We did a lot before Christmas.
Yeah.
And we have done a few.
Yeah. Okay. News.
Yeah. That's true.
But we were diving in. We were talking on the way over about this sort of the future of underwriting, what that might begin to look like. And we've talked on the podcast before around the promise of all the data that we're getting. This market's getting so much more data. As a result, insert a grandiose claims of what we'll be able to do there. But what I thought would be interesting to do is unpack a little bit around what we think the future of underwriting looks like, what we think the role of data, and if in the market we're kind of like drowning in data, but I'm not convinced we're able to turn it into immediate value or insights just yet. So let's unpack these sorts of areas around the future of underwriting in a world drowning in data. All
right. Rogue first analogy.
Go for it.
I'm trying to remember what they're called.
Strongs.
I'm going to pretend that I just didn't want to infringe the actual brand.
Okay.
But shout it out if you know it. And then you'll be in trouble, not me.
Yeah, exactly.
The spaghetti that comes in a tin and has different letters.
Is this another selected mustard analogy?
No, what's the alphabetti spaghetti?
It could be. I've never heard. Oh, are you thinking of?
It's like a children's
SpaghettiOs?
Thank you for the shout from our live audience. Is it called SpaghettiOs?
SpaghettiOs, I think. Yeah.
Basically, I would like this analogy to be based around a kind of tinned, microwavable pasta.
Yep.
Probably offered by some labels that sound like nothing rhymes with Heinz. This is going to be hard. Okay, we'll just say that. Anyway, this pasta comes in lots of different letters, so you can write your name in the pasta that comes out of the tin. Uh-huh. Anyway, the analogy that I wanted to make, now that we've all got that firmly pictured in our heads and tasted in our imaginations as well, is that insurance companies and reinsurance companies and most firms in the industry are kind of in a world where, like you say, we are surrounded by all of this data. But it's all different letters of the spaghetti. We're swimming in this thick, saucy tomatoiness. You get hungry.
So unpleasant.
Right, which is just stuff that's in the way.
Yeah.
And then when we eventually do get to a bit of data, it's this was an A, and I was looking for an S. Or I could spell something with this analogy, but I've started on awkward letters, so I won't try. But gradually, we're able to piece together things and spell words and make sense of the data, but it's with a lot of hard swimming through tomato sauce to try and find the letters that we need. They're never in the right place. They're never in the right order. So as you say, we always talk about the whole alphabet is here. There's so much stuff that we could be using.
We could write an entire novel.
We could.
Around, yep.
But there's so much effort to reach each of those bits of pasta and then to bring them to where they need to go, that we're kind of stuck in this quagmire.
Yeah.
Quagmired in this spaghetti
Couldn't get
sauce.
SpaghettiO. We got quagmire right off the top. I won't venture into an analogy battle because I don't know where I could take it. That would be as good as that. But I think our industry sometimes suffers with this problem of not sufficiently thinking through the why around certain parts of what they're looking to do, especially with respect to data. So, for example, you have a project where we've built this whizzy dashboard that shows a map with circles and you're oh, it looks super slick. What do you use it for? We see the bubbles are where the stuff is, the risks are. Right, and what do you now that you see the bubbles and there's no action point. I think the same thing is happening a lot with data. We're we can put the data all in here, but there's not always a really clear way for therefore we are going to introduce these types of things to understand risk. And I think in some places it's done very, very well. Think about massive data at the sort of insurer level on like motor books, if they are tracking driver behavior and they know for a fact that drivers between these hours have this level of claims likelihood or severity of damage, and they can price risks based on those types of behaviors, that's very helpful in sort of improving pricing at that level. And then so insurers can do that, I think, better. But when you get to the reinsurance space, all the reinsurer really cares about is how successful is that insurance company at writing profitable business. Right?
And this is interesting because as well, insurance, we're dealing often with a scenario where if you can get a data edge on your competitor, potentially you can avoid risks you don't want more easily, and potentially you can access or price more favorably towards, again, the US might have some rules here depending on the state you're in, and other countries too. But in freer insurance markets, you could price very favorably towards risks that you've got data on that say that they're going to be good risks. In a one-at-a-time insurer competition environment, whereas reinsurance, by contrast, has this subscription model where it can be verticalized, but like most of the time, everybody takes the same price at the end. And actually, it's not a great look to come in super cheap compared to everybody else. And likewise, if you come in too expensive, then you're not going to get on the panel. It becomes less about pricing the risk really well and more about loss picking and choosing where on the program you want to get more or less exposure, balanced with how willing are you to support the program in order to get to those positions. I think what we've struggled with, therefore, is when it's come to getting value-adding data into our industry, there's been less willingness to pay for external sources of information when it's not become ubiquitous for all of the players on the panel. Like, so if panel participant number 7 gets an extra source of data that tells it something that would shift the price, unless they can convince the other 6 to change the price as well, then they're just going to be an outlier. They're not going to change the market price. They're just going to know that it is going to perform less well or better than they thought it would.
And they might try to battle for differential terms on one of the layers that they get a slightly bigger signing in exchange for. But you're right. The investment required for what feels, at least at the onset, to be relatively nominal shift in position. Where I think it becomes interesting is part of this broader conversation between the cedent and their broker and the reinsurer, in which you could say something like, this insurance company has these new sources of data that they're using to underwrite risk. They've rolled it out in sort of these 3 areas. You can see these 3 areas are performing better than the other 7 areas. But next year, they're going to start rolling it out to 2 more areas. And then the year after that, 2 more additional areas. And you will see the same directional improvement. And then using that as the narrative to the reinsurance partners to say, therefore, we have justified a sort of decrease or a flat positioning in a hardening market, wherever that might be. But even then, it's sort of like the next year the reinsurers will say, did it actually do that thing, right? So there's this element of, at the reinsurance level, the only thing that matters is the performance of that insurance book.
I agree with you. I think it's more exciting to think how the data can transform things at the insurance level. In the subscription world, you still have similar issues, large commercial deals with lots of players. But if you're able to go to the reinsurance market and say, oh, here's our book and here's how we've chosen systematically all of these policies and how that differentiates us, and here's how it's performing, and so on, and be able to show a much more detailed view of risk than your competitors, that's only going to put you in good stead when it comes to finding reinsurance partners. But for the reinsurers themselves, would it be worth spending lots of money to get satellites following your risks around and taking pictures of them and sending them to you, or finding out that a property has a swimming pool outside it that might slightly change its fire or flood risk? Some of this stuff becomes slightly immaterial. We end up going back to the way we price risk is we put in the inputs in this end of the spreadsheet model and get the numbers out the other end. And whilst everybody's doing that and sort of coalescing around the same output numbers, that feels oddly sustainable.
Well, and that's at that at that rolled up aggregate level, this is where it gets really interesting. So even if the reinsurer was able to interrogate like a massive property bordereau and understand where risks had been mispriced or elements of that risk, as you said, like a pool hadn't been disclosed, out of thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of individual locations, knowing that 6% of them even, or 6 of them have a feature that wasn't accounted for, like it's a subscription market and everything. Like, it's so hard to have that make a material impact, and you're not going to decline writing that entire portfolio, or that entire treaty, because of what you've now identified as a select number of misplaced, underlying policies or similar. So it does become quite complex. But I do think, as you said, there's a ton of interesting work that's being done on the insurance side that will help sort of roll that up. And if you think about, building material surveys and all of these things that they're doing in property and more granular information around casualty markets, all of that I think accrues to the benefit of the reinsurers by sort of improving the performance of the insurance company. But if the performance of the insurance company has been sustained, systemically maybe, but has seen sustained improvement, they're just going to push for lower prices on the reinsurance side anyway. So it's kind of a loss, maybe it'll balance out, a net neutral.
I guess the kind of high level thing we're discovering or unpacking here is, to a great extent, it's more useful for everyone if it's the insurance company that's embracing innovation in some ways and spending the time making itself more effective as the risk manager / carrier. And then sharing that with reinsurers as capital, I guess. I mean, obviously there's like a portfolio level where it comes to, ultimately what perils are you covering against as reinsurers, but that's about like how well do you understand your exposure to certain natural disasters and the probability of those occurring. Or other perils, insert similar explanation here. But I think it probably is true to say that you're going to get much more return by making yourselves a brilliant cedent than you are trying to make yourself a brilliant reinsurer using the same kind of tools.
Yeah, I think on the whole, that's right. I think the value is if the cedent capturing more data, but then having sufficient control of that data that you can then share that upstream, or at least present it to your reinsurers or brokers in a similar way. So if you use building materials as an example, if an insurance company is able to say, like, across the entire bordereau, they have 100% accuracy around every single building material that they have, that gives a level of trust in the data and the output of the CAT models to the reinsurers that they'll get more favorable loss picks accordingly, because there's trust in that, versus 40% of them don't have building materials. Let's just assume timber, and they, and so they know that's happening. So I think part of it is improving the data capture, but also improving the data capture alongside improving your sort of control of that data and your ability to interrogate that data and present that data downstream. I think that transition will be very, very important, because it will build that trust with the reinsurers that you do have that command of the data.
I guess it wouldn't be unfair to say that insurance companies' role in this chain, or possibly an MGA as well, depending on the way that they're distributing, is to bundle risk, to organize risk. Right? They are there to somehow capture all of these individual policyholders who have risks that they want to transfer, and to create organized bundles of risk that can then be passed onto the reinsurance markets and the capital markets. Reinsurers are almost specialist capital providers who have very good understanding of the space, rather than insurers. They're more like smart capital. And insurers their job is, how well can you create a understandable portfolio of business for capital to invest in, which, to your point, kind of makes their main responsibility. Can you show us really great data about your portfolio? because that's going to then make it much easier to get the capital matched with the risk.
Yeah. Well, and if you use that analogy, which I think is really clear about like investors, if we think about traditional investors, if you present to me, here is this this pension fund or this bond that I want to track, a portfolio tracker, I don't really care about the movements of any individual stock in this portfolio. How is this particular fund performed over the last 3 months, 6 months, 5 years? And it's, oh, this has done quite well. It seems to be performing better than other funds that I'm in. I will move more of my money there. Like it's that same kind of mentality. It's them able to build a portfolio of different types of risks that over the course of a longer time horizon will perform better than its sort of peer class. That's I think the game. You're right. That's a smart money game that sits on reinsurance.
Mm-hmm. And then I was thinking about more soup in the background. Not soup. What is it? Spaghetti and sauce.
This is being recorded after lunch, by the way, so Ben is just very malnourished at this.
I am. Yeah, no, it's true. I had a muffin for lunch. It's not good nutrition. But it does feel, I'm going to go non-food with a similar analogy.
Okay.
I think the single alphabeti spaghetti narrative undersells the challenge a little bit when it comes to reinsurance, trying to get the right data sources together. It's almost more like, let's stay with the liquid and floating things kind of thing. You're inside like a giant jar filled with water, and you're trying to get all the pieces of a jigsaw together so that you understand what the jigsaw is a picture of.
Yeah.
But actually inside the jar filled with water or whatever liquid you choose, preferably not too viscous,
mercury.
In that jar you've actually got like several different jigsaw puzzles all just sort of jumbled together. And most of them you've only got like partial completion, as you say, like saying, oh, for this image I can see that 40% of the buildings are possibly timber, and the rest we don't really know. I found a bit of something else, but heavy duty whatever, that's all I know. And then I found this other piece which I think is from a different jigsaw. It does feel like that, I think, sometimes, being in these reinsurers. And they try and structure it together. And a success sometimes is you've got like 70% of the data that you would ideally like about a particular thing, because that gives you enough confidence to know vaguely what you're dealing with. But,
well, and going back to sort of the value of investing to get more, I think you also bump into this sort of law of diminishing returns at a certain point. If you invest $50 million, and now you can identify 10% more of that missing 60. Is that sufficiently valuable to justify that investment? And I think you sort of, that similar math is kind of happening across our industry, where people are investing tens or $50, $100 million on projects to try to improve data capture, but the output is they improved it, but it may have been relatively marginal compared to what they still need, and therefore the actual value of that work isn't realized. If they could get it like 100% coverage, then it may be worth it. But there's sort of like, okay, we got a bit more, but it's not really that. It's not giving us the sort of return that we would have needed for an investment of that size. So there's this exploration of, and maybe this is some of the promise and the appeal of AI is there ways for us to accelerate the capture of that missing piece in a way that allows it to be sufficiently viable based on the cost to do so?
This is where, to some extent, I think AI could be a bit of a red herring for a lot of companies in our space, because I think we're still a relationships business, and I think people still want to back management teams as much as anything else. So when you're looking for who you want to give reinsurance to, who you want to be a partner with, that you follow the fortunes of, you want somebody that you believe is running their business well. And as part of that, you want to see that they've got good data. You want to see that they're running portfolios sensibly and that those portfolios are moving in the right direction. You don't necessarily want to see that they're taking slightly rogue decisions based on quite experimental, inputs from all sorts of data sources that aren't that well tested, or that they're going massively against the grain. I think what they really want to see is just like, tell me what your portfolio is and what's inside it. Give me an idea of what your book is doing. Help me understand why it's performing the way it is. And we can do a lot of business together over the many years to come. Many firms fall at that first hurdle.
Yep.
But the answer is not to jump over that first hurdle and skip it entirely and go straight after the, shiny AI version, because that's going to get you in more trouble if you haven't got the basics right and you haven't managed to assemble a compelling and accurate and straightforward submission pack.
Yeah. So I completely agree with that. What are your thoughts then on sort of algorithmic underwriting and sort of the idea that there'll be some capital, maybe a growing pool of capital that doesn't maybe have that same relationship, and it is more of just gets chucked into, or in maybe even entirely algorithmic underwriting where you might have lead underwriters pricing risk just based on data? Where do you think that could emerge and how that might work in a future world?
Well, I think you mentioned lead and the lead and follow relationship. I think that's fundamental to the economics of it working well. Somebody needs to be doing the hard work and having skin in the game, as the expression goes, to show that it is a valid pursuit that they're willing to put a stake into. Unfortunately, at the moment, there aren't that many structures set up or easily available that enable a lead to get rewarded for doing all of that hard work. And there's a lot of followers that kind of get an equal reward for just rocking up. And so what actually ends up happening most of the time is there's not as much trust that the lead has done loads of work. So the followers do all of the same work again.
Yep.
And everybody gets rewarded about the same, except that maybe the lead can request a larger share. I think if we could find better ways, as I think Lloyd's looked to do on one of its blueprints, of having like a lead that's able to say, right, we dedicate loads and loads of resource to doing a really good job on this type of risk. And then other people are willing to follow on the basis of how much work we're doing, pretty much algorithmically, as you say, and just say categorically we put capital against this. That is exciting. I think what you're seeing, probably the most success there for is things like the consortium model or giving capital to MGAs, where again it becomes kind of like a reinsurance deal again, because you're saying we back that underwriting team, or we back that management team to do a good job and to make sure they've checked all of the data, and to make sure that they're being responsible with the capital that we're giving them.
And remuneration is aligned with performance in many ways as well. So if you're writing good business, remuneration increases, and if you've performed poorly, it decreases, and it's sort of following the fortunes in that respect as well. For me, I think it feels very similar to this idea that in one way it feels inevitable, but inevitable in the way that autonomous vehicles are, right? But like in 2014, Elon Musk said we were 5 years away from fully autonomous. Mm-hmm. In 2016, he said we're 5 more years away from autonomous, and in 2017, and a year ago or so, he was like, we're about 5.5 years away from autonomous, like true fully autonomous. And I feel this same kind of thing is in our industry, where we will forever be 5 years from this being a thing that's happening. And I think that it might look more along the lines of if you're in a Tesla, you've driven a Tesla, there's like, you see the vehicle and you see all these like real-time sensors that are sort of indicating people and other vehicles and traffic lanes and all these sort of things that's sort of feeding through. It might look a lot more like that, where you receive a risk and you have a huge amount of information at your at your disposal and in your hands around the likelihood of performance of that particular piece of business, the impact it might have on your portfolio, the knock-on effect it might have on your retro if you're a reinsurer or similar, and then using that to identify, is this a risk that we should take, and is this the price that we should have for it? It'll look a lot more like that. Not fully autonomous. There's still a person sort of making the call and having the relationship and exploring other conversations with that client or broker about what is driving the performance of this book and why is it performing the way that it is, and having all of those things guide that, but more informed around, I can still see everything in my car, but I'm not quite ready to drive through downtown New York with my hands behind my back.
I think that's sort of the co-pilot version of AI that's coming through as well, right? This idea that, okay, we're not actually going to trust these advanced tools to run rogue and do everything themselves, but what great tools the human will have at their disposal all the time. I think what that ends up bringing us to is actually a talent question and a adoption challenge. Like how willing will people be and how able will people be to actually adopt these extra tools, and how much will the market flex to accommodate their inputs, like we were discussing earlier. It might be that X company invests lots of money in providing clever co-pilot X or extra data source Y, but then underwriter Z doesn't know how to use it, or other underwriter B refuses to use it out of principle, and underwriter C tried to use it, but unfortunately wasn't able to because the market said, well, that's the price, so take it or leave it.
Yep.
So it's not a easily dismissible challenge to get this technology into actual daily usage, as you say.
Yeah. Well, I think there's this process in which you have to build trust in it as well. Like over time, it said it would perform quite well, and I wrote a bunch of risks using it, and most of those risks perform quite well. And then the next batch was similar to how we're seeing people use like ChatGPT for little things. Oh, if I improve these kind of things, it does it better, and I have to add these additional commands to help it guide further still. But if you just come out of the box and just expect it to hit the nail on the head every time, it will miss. And it takes a long time to build that trust. We know that it's done like math wrong. Okay, so we can't always trust that. So you have to have it where it's done that math right every single time for a very long time. And in many ways, like the way Microsoft Excel has earned its trust. Right.
Yep.
When I'm guaranteed in the first few versions of Microsoft Excel, people did not trust that the sum column would correctly add up all the elements in the subsequent in the column. But now we sort of know without fail that if we tell it to add these numbers here, it will be right 100% of the time. And it takes a while. That's the end of my Excel praising that we're going to get on the Reinsurance podcast. But these things do take time. You do have to sort of build up that kind of trust. And I think with all of these tools, all it takes is sort of a couple cases where it didn't work, because it's not just about improving the speed. I think with algorithmic underwriting, the higher level thought is we'll perform the same but with a lower cost base, and therefore our net position is better. And that's one way to approach it. But if we use that driverless car analogy, that's like saying, wait, the whole grid is driverless now. We still have 50,000 or so deaths a year, but no one has to drive. I don't think we'd be thrilled that that's the result. We have to improve the sort of underlying metrics. So I think it has to get to the point where the algorithms at some point are able to use sources of data to fundamentally improve the underwriting result.
I think there's then a huge amount of user training that we have to think about as well, right? Like the human part of this, because yes, these tools can be very powerful, but equally they can be quite hard to adopt. We talked about prompt engineering for the ChatGPT, etc. But where you said, yes, 100% of the time Excel will perform that calculation, unless somebody's got the cell references wrong, or unless somebody's, accidentally forgot to put an equal sign or put the wrong number of brackets, or they've somehow managed to copy and paste a row and it's like screwed up, or something's hidden in a group that nobody knew was there, or it references the wrong tab. There's so many ways that Excel can go wrong. It's far from foolproof, and we've got plenty of, in the nicest possible way, fools who can prove that in our industry. And again, it's not to undermine or diminish the confidence of anyone who does struggle to make Excel perform perfectly 100% of the time. That's always going to be a challenge for talent, whether it's Excel or the next tool. However user-friendly we might make things. But as you say, you've got to have confidence that when you do get it right, the tool is performing as expected, which is not yet the case with some of the newer stuff that's floating around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you mentioned this idea of what it does to talent coming into the space. Because I think you have it where the talent is in many ways expecting there to be greater sophistication than there oftentimes is. Right? If you're a grad coming out and you get an underwriting role or internship at one of the biggest reinsurers in the world, you are likely going to be surprised that many of these really complex pricing tools, et cetera, are still run in Excel-based models.
Yeah.
So I think their expectation that the tools will be more powerful and everything else does exist, but it also creates a dynamic in which are there going to be potentially less jobs? What will those jobs look like if the tooling becomes sufficiently powerful, right? That idea that the pinnacle of the tower has all the data and knowledge, but then the opportunity doesn't really triangulate out where there's this base of young talent that can sort of work their way up. It drops off more precipitously in sort of opportunities available to you.
Yeah, and I guess one of the things to think about here as well is different specialties or specializations of talent as well. I think certainly we forget that often the role of an underwriter can be a business developer type role as much as anything else, and that then a lot of the more technical number crunching is done through actuarial teams, support teams, pricing teams, etc., that will take away, a submission and then come back to the underwriter with a suggestion of price or a recommendation of the price, in which case, often those roles are blended as well, all sorts of combinations across the industry. But in that kind of world, I guess, could you imagine swapping one of those for a Gen AI type interactivity where the tool runs itself and you probably, but what would it take to get the trust?
Yeah. Well, and I think the thing we've always talked about here is, does it allow us to unlock something more creative? If we know the calculation is done correctly, does it allow us to open up a variety of alternative ways to structure something and see what the calculation is for each of those various ways and move the direction more towards solving sufficiently complicated problems without this concern that the underlying component is different? So it's a ton, we'll continue to dive into this topic. Underwriting is always a subject that's a favorite of both us and the fans. And the fans, the mountains of fans. So thank you all for listening. Until next time, use technology to a safe degree.
That's a great sign off.
My goodness, I need to work on that one.
I quite liked it. Thank you for your thoughts, and we look forward to hearing comments from our many subscribers.
Thanks, everyone.